When I stumbled out of Mark's Escalade that night, the city air, sharp and cold for October, hit me first. It cut through the wine haze just enough to remind me I'd overdone it at the partners' party. Mark, always playing the knight in shining armor, insisted on driving me home after my phone died, leaving me stranded for a ride. I thanked him, a little too breathlessly, slamming the door and swaying towards our brownstone. That's when I saw David. He was a silhouette on the stoop, streetlights painting harsh shadows across his face, but the anger radiating off him was unmistakable. Betrayal, suspicion. It was all etched into the rigid set of his jaw. My stomach plummeted. "It's not what it looks like," I blurted, the words sounding pathetic even to my own ears. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me like I was some kind of insect under a microscope. I lurched up the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I had too much to drink," I stammered. "Mark was just being nice. He gave me a ride." "Nice," David repeated, his voice glacial. "That's what you call it?" I froze, suddenly unsure of everything. The accusation hung thick between us, unspoken but deafening. The ground felt like it was cracking beneath my feet. The foundation we'd built, brick by painstaking brick, was starting to crumble. That moment was the beginning of the end. I didn't know it then, but it was the spark that would set everything ablaze: my marriage, my career, my carefully constructed life. All of it would burn down because of one ride home, one stupid mistake, and everything that came after. Looking back now, I see the fault lines were there long before that night. My marriage to David wasn't collapsing because of a single misunderstanding or even one bad choice. It had been unraveling for years, slow motion, almost invisible at first. Just the usual grind: work stress, missed date nights, stupid arguments over whose turn it was to walk the dog. But those little things piled up, brick by brick, into a wall neither of us had the energy or maybe the will to tear down. David and I met in our 20s, fresh off college, bright-eyed in the city that never sleeps. He was charming, ambitious, with this way of making me laugh, even when I felt like the world was ending. He was in finance, a shark in a suit, always chasing the next deal. I was in advertising, clawing my way up at a tiny agency, fueled by ramen and caffeine. We clicked instantly, that explosive, crazy kind of chemistry that made everyone around us roll their eyes with envy. He was my anchor, and I was his biggest cheerleader. But life, New York life especially, has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges. As David's career exploded, so did mine. We moved from a cramped walk-up in the East Village to a brownstone in Brooklyn, settled into routines, and somewhere along the way, the spark started to flicker. He started working Wall Street hours, coming home late, wired and exhausted. I threw myself into my work, climbing the corporate ladder until I landed a corner office at a tech startup downtown. On paper, we had it all. The brownstone, the bonuses, the Hamptons share in the summer. But under the surface, there was this gaping chasm of silence, distance, and the unspoken knowledge that neither of us was truly happy. It didn't help that my job threw me into the orbit of people like Mark. He was my boss, VP of marketing, a silver-haired wolf in a perfectly tailored suit who could command a room without even raising his voice. Mark was that guy. Confident, charismatic, and just flirty enough to make you feel like you were the only woman in the room without ever quite crossing the line. At least not in public. From day one, I could tell he had a soft spot for me. He praised my ideas in meetings, gave me the plum projects, always found an excuse to check in even when it wasn't strictly necessary. At first, I told myself it was mentorship. He saw potential, wanted to groom me for bigger things. And maybe in the beginning that was true. But as the months went on, his attention shifted, became sharper, more personal. He'd compliment my power suits, linger a beat too long during conversations, find reasons to pull me into his corner office for quick chats that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. I tried to brush it off, laughing awkwardly at his comments, steering the conversation back to spreadsheets and ROI. Harmless, I told myself. David, though, wasn't buying it. He met Mark once, briefly, at a company holiday party last year, the kind where everyone pretends to be thrilled to be there. Afterward, he made a comment that stuck with me. "That guy's too smooth," he'd said, a hard edge to his voice. I laughed it off, but I could see David didn't like him, didn't trust him. Over the months, he'd dropped these casual questions about Mark, still working late with your boss, or Mark going to the conference in Vegas. Always that subtle undercurrent of suspicion, a hint of something I tried to ignore. The night of the partners' party, none of that was on my mind. It was the firm's biggest blowout of the year, held at some swanky hotel in Midtown, open bar, live band, the whole 9 yards. I'd spent the entire day agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a black dress, silk, and a little too low cut for my usual taste. David hadn't been thrilled about me going stag. He hated these corporate events more than root canals. But he had a big deal closing, Wall Street never sleeps, and all that. The party was exactly what you'd expect. Loud, flashy, over the top. I spent the first hour making small talk with colleagues, sipping champagne, trying to walk that tightrope between being social and still looking like I had a brain in my head. Mark found me soon after I arrived, complimenting the dress in a way that made my cheeks flush, despite myself. "You always know how to make an entrance, Sarah," he'd said, his eyes lingering just a little too long. As the night wore on, I found myself gravitating towards Mark's orbit. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, his attention laser-focused, intoxicatingly flattering. He poured me another glass of Pinot Grigio, then another, and before I knew it, I was leaning against the bar, laughing too loudly at one of his Wall Street war stories. Innocent, I told myself, just letting loose, enjoying the party. But there was this tiny voice in the back of my head, a warning siren telling me to be careful. By the time I realized how much I'd had, it was too late. My head was spinning, the room tilting, and I could barely stand without swaying. I fumbled for my phone to call a cab, but my fingers felt clumsy, and the Uber app was a blur of icons. Mark noticed immediately. "Let me drive you home," he offered, his voice smooth, reassuring. I hesitated. Instinct screamed no, but the thought of navigating the city streets in my state alone felt impossible. "Are you sure?" I asked, maybe a little too hopefully. "Of course," he said, placing a steady hand on my arm. "I'll make sure you get home safe." "Just a ride," I told myself. Totally fine. But the second I slid into the passenger seat of his Escalade, a jolt of guilt, sharp and cold, shot through me. The drive was quiet, mostly. Mark asked if I was feeling okay, offered me water, played some low jazz on the radio. When we pulled up to our brownstone, I mumbled a thank you, reached for the door handle, desperate to put the whole night behind me. And that's when I saw David standing on the stoop. David didn't budge from his spot as I walked towards him, my heels clicking too loudly on the brownstone steps in the hushed Brooklyn night. My pulse was racing, a nervous tremor in my hands. It wasn't just the wine anymore. It was the way his eyes were boring into me, like he could see right through my carefully constructed facade. He didn't say a word until I reached the bottom of the steps, where I stalled, suddenly unsure how to start. "Want to explain why your boss is dropping you off at, what, midnight?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm, each word clipped and precise. I opened my mouth, scrambling for the right words. Any words. "I had too much to drink at the party," I said too quickly. "I couldn't drive and my phone died, couldn't get a cab. Mark offered to give me a ride. That's all." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek, his eyes narrowed to slits. "That's all?" "Yes," I insisted, taking a step closer. "David, you know me. Nothing happened. He was just being nice." "Nice," he repeated, the word dripping with acid. "Since when does your boss play chauffeur? Or is this just the first time I'm seeing it?" A knot twisted in my stomach, cold and hard. "Don't be ridiculous. It's not like that. I can't control what he does, but I didn't do anything wrong." David let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head slowly. "Sure. And I'm just supposed to believe that, am I? You think I haven't noticed the way he looks at you? Or how much time you've been spending at the office lately?" I froze. The air between us crackled, thick with unspoken accusations. "He's my boss, David. We work together. Of course we spend time on projects. It's called my job." "And the flirting? The compliments? Is that part of the job description now?" His words hit like a physical blow, and I flinched. "There's nothing going on," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're twisting this into something it's not." "Am I?" he shot back, his tone icy. "Because it sure as hell looks like something from where I'm standing." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, a mix of frustration and exhaustion washing over me. "I can't do this right now," I said, pushing past him and heading for the front door. David didn't stop me, but when I glanced back, he was still standing there, a statue of anger and suspicion, arms crossed, face unreadable. Inside, I leaned against the heavy oak door, closing my eyes, trying to take a deep breath. Misunderstanding, I told myself. David would calm down, We'd talk in the morning, but even as I thought it, I could feel the cracks widening, the foundation of our marriage shuddering under the weight of his accusation. The rest of the night was a blur. I went upstairs, changed into pajamas, and crawled into bed, but sleep was a distant country. My mind was a battlefield of emotions. Anger at David for not trusting me, guilt for accepting Mark's ride, and a deep sinking fear that this argument was just the opening salvo. When I finally drifted off, it was to the muffled click of the guest room door closing downstairs. The next morning, the tension was a physical presence hanging heavy in the air. David was already up when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone, a mug of black coffee beside him. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Morning?" I said tentatively, hoping to break the ice. "Morning," he replied curtly, eyes still glued to the screen. I poured myself coffee, the silence stretching, thick and uncomfortable. I wanted to say something, apologize, explain, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. David wasn't the type to let things go easily, and I could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on me, a dark cloud. The uneasy truce held until that evening. I came out of the shower to find David standing in the bedroom, holding my phone. My heart slammed against my ribs as I saw the look on his face. Cold, accusing, furious. "What are you doing with my phone?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Funny thing," he said, holding it up. "You left it on the counter, unlocked. So I decided to take a little peek. Guess what I found?" My stomach twisted into a knot. "David, give me my phone." He ignored me, his eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the screen. "Let's see. Here's a text from Mark. Looking stunning tonight. And this one, let me know when you get home safe. Just your boss being nice, right?" He looked up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "David, stop," I said, taking a step closer, reaching for the phone, but he pulled it back, his grip tightening. "Did you ever think to tell him to stop?" he demanded. "Or were you enjoying the attention a little too much?" "I didn't encourage him," I said, my voice trembling. "I was going to talk to him about it, but..." "But what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You were too busy letting him drive you home, letting him flirt with you? What the hell, Sarah?" I felt tears streaming down my face, frustration and guilt bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said, though the words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. David let out a bitter laugh, tossing the phone onto the bed. "Sure, keep telling yourself that." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking. I picked up my phone, staring at the messages he'd found. They weren't explicit, but they weren't innocent either. Mark's compliments, his playful emojis, his late-night texts, it was all there laid out in black and white. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rewind time, undo everything that had led to this moment. But it was too late. The damage was done. David barely spoke to me for days. Not outright hostile, but a coldness had settled over him, a glacial distance I couldn't bridge. He went through the motions, going to work, coming home, zoning out on the couch with his laptop, but it was clear he was keeping me at arm's length, locked out of his world. I tried to talk to him once, late one night, after we were both in bed. The city sounds muffled outside our window. I turned to him in the dark, reaching for his hand. "David, I love you," I said quietly. "Please, can we just talk about this?" He pulled his hand away, his voice flat. "I'm tired, Sarah. We'll talk later." But later never came. The days after the fight with David blurred into a surreal routine of silence and avoidance. It wasn't aggressive, not outwardly cruel, but the way he moved through the brownstone, cold and detached, made it clear he didn't trust me, maybe didn't even see me anymore. I tried to act normal, hoping the tension would dissipate, but it was like trying to outrun a shadow. The weight of his suspicion was a constant presence, following me even out the door, into the city. At work, things were different. I became hyper-aware of Mark's every word, every gesture. David's accusations had shifted my perspective, like a new lens. I started to notice how often he stopped by my desk, how his compliments always seemed just a shade too personal, how his gaze lingered a beat too long. I told myself it was nothing, just my own paranoia, but deep down, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. When Mark leaned against the edge of my desk one afternoon, his eyes lingering on me, a moment too long, "You look tired," he said, his voice low, just for me. I forced a smile, glancing back at my computer screen. "Just a lot on my mind." "Anything I can help with?" he asked, his tone almost playful. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The conversation was innocuous on the surface, but the way he looked at me, that knowing glint in his eyes, sent a flutter of something unsettling through me. Later that week, Mark called me into his office to review a new ad campaign. The meeting started normal enough. Market research, demographics, budget projections, the usual corporate jargon. But as we talked, his tone shifted, became less about spreadsheets and more intimate. "You've seemed distracted lately," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, the city skyline glittering behind him. I looked down at the presentation folder in my lap, avoiding his gaze. "Just personal stuff," I said vaguely. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his voice softening. The question caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, the words just spilled out. "David thinks I'm having an affair." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "With who?" I hesitated, my face flushing crimson. "With you." For a moment, he didn't say anything, just studied me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous," he said. "We're colleagues, friends even, nothing more." His reassurance should have made me feel better, should have eased the knot of anxiety in my chest, but the way he said it, the casual dismissal, left me feeling oddly deflated. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't have said anything." "Hey," he said, his tone softening again. "It's fine, really. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." I nodded, mumbled a quick thanks, and practically fled his office. But as I walked back to my cubicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted between us. The next few days passed in a haze of forced smiles and strained silences. The tension between David and me only thickened. He still barely spoke, and when he did, it was clipped, sarcastic, like he was holding back a torrent of rage. One evening, I stayed late at the office, trying to bury myself in work. Most of the building had emptied out, leaving the hushed quiet of a deserted skyscraper. I was so focused on my laptop screen, I didn't notice Mark standing in my doorway until he cleared his throat. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, stepping into the room. "Something like that," I said, leaning back in my chair, rubbing my temples. He walked over to my desk, glancing at the spreadsheet on my screen. "You work too hard, Sarah," he said, his voice low, intimate. "You deserve a break." I let out a small, nervous laugh. "Tell that to my deadlines." Mark didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned against the edge of my desk, his gaze steady, intense. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone shifting, becoming something else entirely. "You're one of the most talented people I've ever worked with, and yet, I feel like you don't hear that enough." "Mark, I started, but he cut me off, his hand reaching out, brushing against mine. "No, really," he said, his fingers closing around my hand. "You deserve more than what you're getting, at work, at home, everywhere." The way he said it, the intensity in his eyes, made my heart race. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat as I realized how close he was, how charged the air had become. "Mark, I don't think..." Before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. For a moment, I froze, caught between shock and the undeniable pull of the moment. And then, against every fiber of my being, I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me closer. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to pull away, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. There was something intoxicating about the way he held me, the way he made me feel seen, desired, in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally broke apart, the reality of what had just happened crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged, unsteady. This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. Mark didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, a mix of desire and something else, something darker. "I'm sorry," he said finally, though his tone didn't sound particularly apologetic. I shook my head, grabbed my bag, and practically ran out of the office. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins, guilt, confusion, and a terrifying flicker of something else, something I couldn't name, churned inside me. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake, a blip that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, a small, treacherous voice whispered, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I avoided Mark like the plague. I threw myself into work, burying myself in spreadsheets and conference calls, pretending the kiss had never happened. But it had. And everything had changed. Every time I saw him in the hallway, in meetings, even across the crowded office, I felt a jolt of guilt, hot and sharp, mixed with that undeniable forbidden spark. And the worst part? A terrifying, shameful part of me wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. David's silence wasn't passive. It wasn't the kind of quiet where things slowly fade. It was loud, sharp, deliberate, like every unsaid word was a weapon he was carefully sharpening, choosing the perfect moment to strike. I could feel it constantly, a low hum of tension vibrating through our brownstone. Every time I walked into a room, every forced good morning, every clipped good night. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. But I had no idea just how calculated he was being, how meticulously he was building his case. At work, things with Mark were a minefield. After the kiss, avoidance was my only strategy. I buried myself in projects, ate lunch at my desk, took the stairs instead of the elevator, anything to minimize contact. I wasn't sure what I expected, that he'd pretend it never happened, that we could go back to the brittle professional facade we'd constructed. Mark wasn't the type to let things slide. When he walked into a meeting, his eyes would find mine, and I'd feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. He wasn't overtly pushy, but his mere presence was enough to keep me on edge, a constant reminder of my own weakness. It wasn't long before he cornered me in his office again. Late meeting, everyone else gone, the city lights twinkling outside the window. I was packing up, finally ready to escape, when he called my name, his tone soft, almost apologetic. But there was an undercurrent, a hint of something else. Determination. "Can we talk?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Sarah," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach twisted at his words, a sickening mix of guilt and that forbidden thrill. "This isn't right, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm married." His lips curved into a faint, almost knowing smile. "Are you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and piercing. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that we were just going through a rough patch. But the words caught in my throat, choked by the truth. Because deep down, I knew what he meant. David and I hadn't been a real couple in years. We were roommates, at best. Strangers sharing a brownstone, a mortgage, a history that was slowly turning to dust. Mark stepped closer, his hand brushing my cheek. "You deserve to be happy, Sarah," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "You deserve someone who sees you." His words were like a key, unlocking something inside me, something I'd kept buried for too long. Before I could stop myself, I was kissing him again, the weight of my guilt, my shame, temporarily drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. This time, I didn't pull away. What started as stolen kisses in his office, furtive touches in empty hallways, quickly escalated. It wasn't just the physical connection, though that was undeniable, electric. It was the way Mark made me feel, like I was the center of his universe. He listened when I talked, remembered the smallest details, made me feel like I mattered, like I was seen, truly seen, in a way David hadn't in years. I told myself it was just a fling, a temporary escape, a pressure valve to release the unbearable tension of my life. But the more time I spent with Mark, the harder it became to separate fantasy from reality, to remember where the line was and why I shouldn't cross it. Meanwhile, David was watching. I didn't know it then, but every late night at the office, every mumbled excuse, every carefully crafted lie was being meticulously cataloged, scrutinized, filed away. He never confronted me again about Mark, not directly, but his questions became sharper, more pointed, laced with a chilling undercurrent of knowledge. "How's work?" he'd ask, his tone deceptively casual, but his eyes like ice. "You've been spending a lot of time down there lately." I brushed it off, told myself he was just being paranoid, that I was imagining things. But the truth was, I was underestimating him. David wasn't the type to make accusations without proof. He was methodical, patient, and he was determined to get it. One night, after another late meeting with Mark, a lie, of course, it was just dinner, drinks, stolen hours in a hotel bar, I came home to find David sitting on the couch, bathed in the blue light of his laptop screen. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I told you, I had a meeting," I replied, kicking off my heels, dropping my bag by the door. "Must have been some meeting," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Something in his voice, the chilling calm, sent a shiver of premonition down my spine. But I shrugged it off, too tired, too emotionally depleted to deal with another confrontation. I headed upstairs, desperate for a shower, for sleep, for escape. It wasn't until later, as I was changing for bed, that I realized my phone was missing. Panic flared. I searched the bedroom, my purse, the kitchen, retracing my steps, growing increasingly frantic. Finally, I went back downstairs. David was still on the couch, laptop open, exactly as I'd left him. My stomach dropped when I saw my phone, lying innocently on the coffee table in front of him. "Looking for this?" he asked, picking it up, holding it out. I reached for it, relief flooding through me, but he snatched it back, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Interesting messages you've got here," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational, but laced with a venom that made my blood run cold. My heart stopped. "David, give me my phone." "Sure," he said, tossing it onto the couch beside him like it was a dirty rag. "But you might want to explain why your boss is booking hotel rooms under his name and texting you things like, 'Can't wait to see you again.'" I froze, the air knocked out of me. My mind blanked, scrambling for an explanation, any lie that might salvage this. "You went through my phone?" I whispered, the words barely audible. "You left it on the counter," he said with a shrug, his eyes like chips of ice. "What was I supposed to do? Ignore the notifications from Mark popping up at 11 p.m.? "David, it's not what you think," I stammered, the lie sounding pathetic, even to my own ears. "Don't insult me," he snapped, his voice finally cracking, rising with a raw, unleashed fury. "You've been lying to me for weeks. Hell, maybe months. And for what? Him?" Tears welled in my eyes, a mix of shame and despair. I tried to find the right words to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but there were no words left. The chasm between us was too wide, too deep. The damage was irreparable. The next few days were a living nightmare. David dropped the pretense of civility, unleashing a torrent of barbed comments, accusations, and icy contempt. I could feel the anger radiating off him, a palpable heat in the air whenever we were in the same room. But he didn't confront me again, not directly. Not in words, anyway. It wasn't until I started noticing the whispers at work, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked by, that I realized the full extent of his calculated revenge. Then, Angela from HR called me into her office, her expression grim, professional, but with a hint of something else. Pity? Disgust. "We received some concerning emails," she said, sliding a printed copy of a screenshot across her polished desk. My blood ran cold. The texts between Mark and me, intimate, incriminating, laid out in stark black and white. David had sent them to HR, and not just HR. He'd carpet-bombed my entire professional network. Colleagues, clients, even a few casual acquaintances. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mark was summoned to a disciplinary hearing, his career suddenly teetering on the brink. He tried to shield me, to take the blame, but there was only so much he could do. By the end of the week, I was out of a job, my reputation in ruins, my carefully constructed life reduced to ashes. At home, in what was once my home, things were even worse. David made no attempt to hide his satisfaction as he watched me pack my things, stuffing my life into boxes, stripping the brownstone of my presence piece by piece. "You brought this on yourself," he said, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion but a chilling satisfaction. I hope he was worth it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The first night after I left the brownstone, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of the city, the kind with threadbare carpets, flickering neon signs, and the faint smell of stale cigarettes clinging to everything. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my suitcase half unpacked on the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the aging building settling into itself. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel on a grainy black and white movie screen. I tried calling Mark, my fingers numb, my voice trembling. He didn't pick up. It didn't surprise me. His life was in just as much chaos as mine. David's scorched earth campaign had reached every corner of our professional circles. While I'd been summarily fired, Mark wasn't far behind. His name was splashed across industry blogs, office gossip chains, his reputation dragged through the mud. Rumors about his personal life, his failing marriage, his past indiscretions ran rampant. For all his confidence, his polished veneer, he was just as exposed, just as vulnerable as I was. Part of me hated myself for dragging him down with me. Another, darker part wondered if he'd ever really cared about me at all, or if I was just another conquest, another mistake he wished he could erase. Over the next few days, I tried to pick up the shattered pieces of my life. I crashed on a friend's couch in Queens, someone I hadn't seen much in recent years, but who welcomed me without judgment, without questions. She didn't pry, didn't offer unsolicited advice, just handed me a mug of chamomile tea and told me I could stay as long as I needed. It was a kindness I didn't feel I deserved, but I clung to it, a fragile lifeline in the storm. Mark finally called a week later, his voice raw, exhausted, more strained than I'd ever heard it. "Sarah," he said, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears welling up again. "I know," he said, his tone softer, gentler than I expected. "It's not your fault." But it was, at least partly. We both knew it. He suggested we meet for coffee, somewhere discreet in the West Village. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay hidden, to disappear. But something, a morbid curiosity maybe, or a need for closure, made me agree. Seeing him again felt strange, almost dreamlike. He looked the same, still impeccably dressed, still composed, still Mark. But there was a heaviness in his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. The confident facade had cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. We talked for hours, picking apart the wreckage, trying to make sense of the senseless. He told me his wife had found out. The same emails David had so generously distributed. She'd left him, taken the kids, filed for divorce. I wanted to feel sympathy, to offer comfort, but instead I just felt empty, numb. I realized then, sitting across from him in that crowded coffee shop, the city swirling around us, that whatever fragile, toxic thing we'd had or thought we'd had was over. Irrevocably, finally over. There was no saving it, no rebuilding from the ashes. Too much damage had been done, and neither of us had the strength, or maybe the desire, to fight for something that had never been built to last in the first place. When we said goodbye that day, a brief, awkward hug in the doorway, it felt final, complete. "Take care of yourself," he said, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the anonymous New York crowd. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I'd never see him again. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild, slowly, tentatively. I applied for jobs, sent out resumes, networked with contacts who hadn't yet heard the whispers. The weight of what I'd done, of everything I'd lost, never truly left me, but I learned to carry it, to navigate the sideways glances, the veiled judgments, the awkward silences from people who knew too much. David filed for divorce shortly after I moved out. The process was quick, efficient, brutal, like ripping off a bandage soaked in acid. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to negotiate, didn't want anything but to erase me from his life. And I couldn't blame him. I signed the papers without a fight, knowing I had no right to ask for anything more. One night, months later, sitting alone in my tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, the city lights painting stripes across my bare walls, I found myself scrolling through old photos of David and me. Back when we were happy, back when the city felt full of promise, not just shattered dreams, I wondered for the millionth time if I could have done something differently. If there was a moment, a decision, a word unsaid, that could have changed everything, saved us from this catastrophic unraveling. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. We'd been broken long before Mark walked into my office, long before that fateful night. My mistakes, my choices may have been the final, fatal blow. But they weren't the only ones to blame. Time moved forward, relentlessly, indifferently, as it always does in New York. I found a new job, a smaller company, a fresh start in a different borough where no one knew my name or my story. It wasn't glamorous, not corner office, power suit kind of work. But it was mine. A chance to prove to myself that I could still stand even after the firestorm. I cut ties with everyone from my old life, including Mark. It was painful, a severing of something raw and infected. But eventually it became a relief, like shedding a skin that had become too tight, too toxic. The hardest part, the constant, gnawing ache, was forgiving myself. There were nights, still are, when the guilt hits me like a rogue wave, crashing over me, pulling me under. But slowly, painstakingly, I'm learning to breathe through it, to remind myself that I am not defined by my worst mistakes. I am not just the wreckage I left behind. I am something more, something still being built. Every now and then, in the quiet moments between meetings, between subway rides, between sleepless nights staring at the city skyline, I catch myself thinking about David. I wonder if he's happier now, if he's found someone new, someone who can give him the things I couldn't. Part of me hopes he has. He deserved it, even if I didn't. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. My life isn't perfect, far from it. It's messy, complicated, full of scars that will probably never fully fade. But it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, I feel like I'm finally living it for myself.